Committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time without objection. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Quorum being present, we now proceed to today's business. I yield myself time for an opening statement. Today we meet to consider 7 important bills, more bills that our committee will produce. These to help improve the lives of everyday Americans and help protect our financial system. I want to thank members for their hard work. Members really on both sides of the aisle. We have produced many bipartisan bills in this committee. 2 of today's bills, H.R. 1511, Homeless Children and Youth Act of 2017, sponsored by the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers. H.R. 2069, the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act of 2017, sponsored by Mr. Turner of Ohio, off the committee, are aimed at reducing homelessness amongst youth and other vulnerable populations by improving housing services through federal, state, and local levels. We'll also consider H.R. 2570, the Mortgage Fairness Act of 2017, sponsored by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey. It'll make it simpler and easier for consumers to obtain a mortgage loan so that they can, too, achieve their version of the American dream. 2 more bills are aimed at improving state banking and insurance regulations to increase access to these financial products and services. The State Insurance Regulation Preservation Act, sponsored by Mr. Rothfuss, and the Bank Service Company Examination Coordination Act, sponsored by Mr. Williams. Finally, on the docket today, we have 2 bills to better prevent bad actors and terrorists from using our financial systems to gain access to both weapons and digital currencies for their own benefit. The Financial Technology Protection Act, sponsored by Mr. Budd, and the Improving Strategies to Counter Weapons Proliferation Act, sponsored by Mr. Tipton. If we report these bills favorably today, which I'm confident we will do, the committee will have reported 130 bills out favorably to the House since January of 2017. Indeed, we are one of the hardest working committees on this Hill, and this could not be done without the dedication and commitment of members on both sides of the aisle, and your efforts are appreciated to make us clearly one of the most productive committees in Congress. I now yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say that I was encouraged by a bipartisan agreement on the Jobs Act 3.0 package and the resulting House passage of the bill with overwhelming support last week. The Jobs and Investor Confidence Act of 2018 is evidence that we can come together to advance common sense solutions that will benefit our nation's small businesses and investors. This committee should now focus on helping to improve the housing situation in this country. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there is no state, metro area, or county in which a worker earning the federal minimum wage or prevailing state minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rent by working a standard 40-hour week. While I see that we will be considering 3 housing bills today, these bills will not improve housing in this country and will instead either reduce protections for mortgage borrowers or contribute to increasing the rates of homelessness or unstably housed persons. For example, H.R. 2570 undermines the limitations on points and fees for mortgages established under the Consumer Bureau's qualified mortgage rule. This bill would make it easier for lenders to steer home buyers into high-cost abusive terms on some mortgages, notably home equity lines of credit, where yield spread premiums have not been prohibited. This bill would bring American borrowers back to the very kinds of abusive lending practices that contributed to the subprime meltdown and the ensuing foreclosure crisis. A second bill slated for consideration today, H.R. 2069, has the worthy goal of providing housing assistance for foster youth aging out of care, but the bill provides no increased funding to provide that assistance and instead tells hundreds of thousands of people who are waiting for assistance, including veterans, persons experiencing homelessness, families with children, and victims of domestic violence, that they have to wait a little longer. The The bill also imposes harmful and counterproductive work requirements on foster youth who receive housing through the federal preference established in this bill. The third bill, H.R. 1511, expands the definition of homelessness for HUD homeless programs to include over 4 million additional people without providing any additional funding to support the expansion. Mr. Chairman, as I have said at committee proceedings many times, we need to dedicate real funding and resources to tackle the homelessness crisis. Over 500,000 people in this country are experiencing homelessness, and Congress has a duty to help them. That's why last year I introduced H.R. 2076, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2017, which would provide $13.27 billion in new funding over 5 years to federal programs and initiatives to prevent homelessness. Mr. Chairman, this committee should be considering bills such as the Ending Homelessness Act and other Democratic bills to help vulnerable families and hardworking Americans. As a nation, we're in the midst of a housing affordability crisis and a homelessness crisis. It simply must be a top priority for this committee to improve the state of housing in this country and tackle homelessness, and shifting funding to help some people instead of others and undermining borrowers' protections are not the answer. Not the answers. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Now pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1511. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1511 to amend the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance
Without
Act.
objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for including this bipartisan bill to help homeless children and youth in the markup today. Only a few weeks ago, this committee heard testimony of Kat Lilly, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Family Promise Emergency Shelter in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Kat offered her expertise as someone familiar with HUD policies and programs and their impact on the day-to-day operations of service providers in meeting the needs of homelessness. But more importantly, she's a mother of 6 children who personally navigated her family through HUD's bureaucracy in a struggle to keep her children off the streets. She looked everywhere to find housing. She turned to friends, neighbors, shelters, even filthy motels unfit for children. Her experience with the current system led her to advocate for the solutions contained in this bipartisan bill that I've introduced with David Loebsack and many other Republicans and Democrats. The hearing our committee held on the topic has demonstrated the emotional trauma suffered by countless of families and young people who don't fit into HUD's restrictive definition of homelessness, but who most Americans would agree are homeless. And when I say that countless families and children are experiencing these problems, I mean it. Not only are these individuals generally turned away for HUD services, they aren't even counted in HUD's homelessness statistics. So it's no wonder that these children and families are often referred to as the invisible homeless. By aligning HUD's definition of homelessness with those used by other federal agencies and programs, families that are truly vulnerable will be counted and served. I know the ranking member brought up funding, and HUD recently last week announced some grants for youth homelessness, which I think is great. But if we can't quantify the problem of youth homelessness, we can never solve it. Lastly, and by the way, I want to mention that I will support additional funding, but I think it's important we quantify the problem first. Lastly, I want to emphasize that my bill does nothing to prevent communities from pursuing a housing-first model for addressing homelessness. My bill does not force any specific communities, and every community can address homelessness in a way that they see fit. Rather, this bill empowers communities and homeless service providers to choose strategies that are unique to serving the homeless population in their community. First, it quantifies the homeless population properly and then allows them to serve that population. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 1511, and I reserve the balance of my time.
I don't think the gentleman can
I'm
reserve.
sorry,
Would you
and I
yield?
yield back the balance.
Would
of
you
my-
yield to the chairman?
How about I yield to the chairman?
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to thank the gentleman for his leadership here. And indeed, this is about prioritization, something that is our job. And we know that among the homeless population, this is arguably the most vulnerable population. And why the HUD definition does not equate with some of the other definitions within the Code of Federal Regulation, I do not know. Anybody who spent any time working with the homeless populations know that regrettably, there are many who suffer from substance abuse. There are many who have mental health issues. There's homelessness due to broken families and abusive relationships. There are those who are simply have economic reversals, but none of these are the responsibility of the youth and the children. And we know that if we don't catch this quickly, if we don't get these people on the right path, they could eventually lapse into these other categories. And so, again, there are two separate issues. One is prioritization. Of the existing funds, what is the prioritization? I think it is important that we do include children and youth who are verified as homeless into the HUD definition. So some will argue, well, there needs to be greater resources. There always needs to be greater resources. But that is not the debate today. The debate today is about prioritization. And again, I want to thank the gentleman from Ohio for his leadership, and I would encourage all members to support his legislation. I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio, whose time now has expired, who seeks recognition. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start by saying that I sincerely appreciate the goals of those that support this legislation. We know that when children and youth lack access to stable housing, it can be detrimental to their academic success as well as their health and emotional well-being. So I wholeheartedly agree that the children and youth that this bill seeks to include in HUD's definition of homelessness should receive assistance, and I'm prepared to support the expansion of the definition in this bill if there is funding to support it, which is what the amendment I intend to offer would do. However, I'm concerned that expanding the definition without increasing the amount of funding could divert funding away from homeless children and youth with the most acute housing needs. In particular, this bill would specifically prohibit the Secretary of HUD from setting national priorities and incentivizing evidence-based strategies in the Continuum of Care program, which would severely undermine significant progress we have made under the Obama administration in reducing homelessness through the coordination of a national strategy to end homelessness. Currently, under HUD's definition of homelessness, there are nearly 170,000 homeless children and youth that make up over 30% of the total homeless population. These are children and youth that are sleeping on the streets, in cars, in emergency shelters, or other places not fit for human habitation. If we want to expand HUD's definition of homelessness, let's make sure it doesn't come at the expense of these children and youth that are homeless under the current definition. So I would simply urge my colleagues to adopt my amendment to provide the necessary funding to help these children and youth. But without it, I must oppose this legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. Chairman and members, this is a serious subject, and I'm pleased that we have some time here today to at least talk about it. I am disappointed that we would take from one and give to the other. It just doesn't make good sense. If we're going to deal with homelessness in this country, we're going to have to put the resources up to deal with it. To say that somehow you're going to ask those children, some of whom are still standing in line, and those families, to just continue to wait while we include some others that we think fit a definition that we prefer, is just not reasonable. And I believe that everybody in here on both sides of the aisle would like to do something about homelessness, but you cannot do it in the way that you are intending to do it. We must put the resources and make them make them available so that we can take these children off the street and out of the cars, so that they can get to school, so that they can improve their academic possibilities. So let's at least think about supporting an amendment to support what we think should be done for homeless children and families. Otherwise, it's not going anywhere. It can't be done. And so I'm going to yield back the balance of my time, but I'm just disappointed that we would approach our homeless crisis this way. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to lend my support to the gentleman from Ohio and his bill that we're marking up today, H.R. 1511, the Homeless Children and Youth Act. I got to tell you that I'm initially disappointed in what I'm hearing from my friends across the aisle. The fact that we can't figure out how to improve definitions to include children. I mean, children are the most vulnerable that we have in our society and are the most vulnerable in a homeless crisis. I mean, this is about us making government work. We're going to make government work. And I think it's rich to hear the ranking member. I think she said, we don't want to take from one to give to another, which in a debate about socialism recently, which her wing of the party has taken over, I think that's the definition. This is about equal outcomes, taking from everybody and equalizing the pie. But that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is saying, hey, listen, we've had policies that are growing the economy. And you know that I've worked at great lengths with Mr. Cleaver on a number of different issues, and we recognize there's different reasons for homelessness. But there has been one category of folks who've just fallen on hard times. They've lost a job, or their car is broken down, and they've lost a job, and they've lost their house. And with that group, the fact that we have a growing economy, that we're able to offer people, even in tough places, more jobs and better wages because of tax reform, because of streamlining rules and regulation, has actually been remarkable, taking less resources from the program, actually freeing up dollars to put towards these kids because we're fixing the definition, Mr. Chairman, and I'm proud of this committee. You know, oftentimes if you listen here, we're talking about banking or capital markets or insurance, but if you listen closely, we actually talk about homelessness and those who are the most vulnerable of the homeless and how we make these programs work better. And we can always say, spend more money, spend more money. I won't do anything unless you spend more money. Well, let's actually have a conversation about how we spend money well and on those who are most in need. And Mr. Stiver's bill gives some uniformity to the definition of homelessness that, again, includes our children. And I would hope that at some point this bill could become bipartisan. But, you know, in a partisan environment, even when we talk about kids and making government and definitions work, I won't be shocked that it doesn't. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks
Chairman.
recognition? For a purpose, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, it's amazing. Even the American people who are perhaps watching this on C-SPAN know that when you increase your family with more children, you obviously are going to have to increase your budget to take care of those children. How in the world, and let me just say, Mr. Stivers is a tremendous friend. I certainly support the thesis of what he is attempting to do. I've worked with him before. But this is totally wrong, and Ms. Waters is absolutely right. And nobody can question Ms. Waters' dedication and devotion to fighting homelessness. But let's get real. And my good friend, Mr. Duffy, has said, you know, we want to get a bipartisan bill. And I do too. But you can't put a bill forward and think you're very serious when you say you're expanding your category to add to the definition children and youth, and you put no money there. That is absolutely wrong. And we want a bipartisan bill, but I think we have to realize what the situation is. There are hundreds of thousands of Americans sleeping in the street in every one of our districts. We see them. They're sleeping under the viaducts. They're sleeping in abandoned cars. Many are just sleeping there, victims of crime, victim of drugs. It is wrong for the American people to see this picture. And you know what breaks my heart so is thousands of these are our veterans. Homelessness is growing at a faster rate of our veterans than any other group. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get serious with this. And I want us to do the first step of bipartisanship and join with Ms. Waters, and let's support this amendment. Now, all of us were here a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago, when my good friend, Mr. Ben Carson, came before this committee and basically said, we are going to take a bulldozer to HUD's budget by, first of all, zeroing out the budget of the CBDG program, the one instrument that we have to help the poor, to help with the homelessness. So let's not throw this smoke and mirrors. I just urge us to get serious, very serious about homelessness, and realize, let us put, and we all have passion on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, but passion without money and resources to make that passion real is just smoke and mirrors. And so, Mr. Chairman, I urge you to let's take serious the amendment that Ms. Waters has, and also let's move to get her bill, which is H.R. 2676, the end, not redefine homelessness, but to end homelessness. This is a great country. And let's step forward and show our greatness by putting our money where our mouth is. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose, gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Get your microphone, please, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Congressman Stivers for introducing this great bill. Back in 1981, a government panel on children's health care penned the often repeated, endlessly echoed statement that children are 1/3 of the population, but they're all the future. Those words were inspiring coming from the government and very appropriate to Congressman Stivers' bill, the Homeless Children and Youth Act. When you held the recent hearing on this bill, Mr. Chairman, I remarked what a massive problem homelessness poses to our nation and to all of our communities. At the hearing, we heard the inspiring testimony of Ms. Kat Lilly of Family Promise, an organization that I've been very fond of and support regularly in my home church. Ms. Lilly told us that the current definition of homelessness does in fact leave out many vulnerable families that lack stable homes. Congressman Stivers has been teaching us how the current statutory definition for HUD causes critical resources to be wasted in the administration of our homeless programs. We can't let the effectiveness of our homeless programs suffer just because of faulty definitions, and it's so wonderful that you're correcting those. The legislation corrects the current inequities and inefficiencies and will contribute to the stability of families now excluded simply by definition and enhance the efficiency of our efforts to help the homeless families. And contrary to some rhetoric, this bill will not congest or dilute our homeless assistance programs. With a small change, we can do enormous good on that front. Mr. Chairman, we all know the special place that our faith holds for children. Nurturing our families is also a national value. By voting for this bill today, we've an opportunity to help many, many more children. When you think about it, that is really a pretty big deal. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Stivers' bill and yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Congressman Stivers.
Thank you to the gentleman from Florida. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since the gentleman from Georgia brought it up, I would ask the gentleman from Florida, did you get a raise when you had another kid? Because when I've had 2 children, and I didn't get a raise either time I got kids. And I'm not opposed to more funding. I just think we need to quantify the issue first. And since the gentleman from Georgia brought it up, did the gentleman from Florida, did any of us get a raise when we had a kid?
I think it just worked just the opposite.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Will the gentleman from Florida yield?
I'll yield back the balance of my time to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. Anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from Ohio.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. There are no easy answers to solving the homeless epidemic we have throughout our cities and our towns in this country. But to be sure, something needs to be done. I agree with the Ranking Member. I think she is right that Congress needs to step up and provide the funding necessary to end homelessness. There is no reason why this Congress can spend over $1.5 trillion on a corporate tax cut, but cannot provide the adequate funds to ensure that every American has a roof over their heads. They say you cannot solve a problem until you identify the problem. This bill looks to do just that. At the beginning of this Congress, I went on a fact-finding mission and visited Huckleberry House, a crisis shelter and runaway youth in the Columbus metropolitan area. Huckleberry House welcomes teens and families that face problems at home, including abuse, violence, addiction, and yes, homelessness. If it were not for them, these kids would likely be on the street or worse, living in abusive, untenable living conditions. Many of these kids might not technically meet the definition today of homelessness in the eyes of HUD, but they are homeless. But for all intentions and purposes, these kids need housing assistance as much as anyone else. Like my colleagues, I too don't want to pick, but there are children and there are our future. To deny them assistance because they technically don't meet HUD's definition of homelessness, in my opinion, is wrong. I would also like to say that I believe this bill will help HUD and Congress identify the scope of the homeless youth problem in this country while harmonizing the different definitions of homelessness within our federal agencies. So I support both. I support putting additional funds, the amendment from Ranking Member Waters, and I also fully support this bill. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield to the Ranking Member if she needed more time. If the Ranking Member needs more time, I'll yield to
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. And I'm sitting here trying to have a conversation, but I'm not happy at all. And I'm just very concerned that I work in an institution where we can reduce the tax responsibilities of the richest corporations in America, corporations and this tax scam bill that we had went from 35% to 21%. And we have people here on the opposite side of the aisle talking about taking from one family, and they have framed it in such a way that these families that we're housing and that are standing in line waiting for assistance don't have children. These are families with children that are waiting for some assistance. And I want to tell you, the shelters all over this country are overrun. In Los Angeles, at one of the shelters, people are sleeping in the yard of the shelter. And they come here with a meaningless piece of legislation that talks about housing children, but not in addition to the children that need housing, housing more children in some way without more money, and then make jokes out of it. Talking about, I had a second child and I didn't get a raise. I don't appreciate that this morning. And I don't appreciate the fact that the idea for resources is absolutely being ignored. And when their friend, Mr. Ben Carson, was before this committee, they didn't say a word to him about it. And now they're coming talking about they don't like his definition. Well, go on up to HUD and tell him you don't like the definition. And while you're up there, tell him to put some money into housing homeless children and families in this country. And so I want to thank you, Ms. Beatty, for your comments and for yielding back my time. But I'm not about to be satisfied with these meaningless comments from the opposite side of the aisle today. And while Mr. Duffy is here pretending to be my friend, I don't even want to talk to him. Go back the balance of my time.
Does any other member seek recognition?
I still have 19 seconds
Oh, I'm
on
sorry.
my time, Mr. Chair.
I apologize.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member seek recognition?
Green from Texas, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Green, what does a gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Would you strike the last word?
Strike the last word.
Recognized
Mr.
for 5
Chairman.
minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, am concerned about homelessness. And I think that what we're doing today is confessing that there is a need that is not being met. And I think that if we acknowledge the need, then I think that we should acknowledge the need to satisfy the need. What I'm saying simply is this: let's not establish this principle, if you will, of just expanding programs but not fulfilling the needs of the people in so doing. This is going to be very painful when we find the rubber meeting the road, as it were, when people are having to all compete for a very small coffer. It's just not the thing to do in this, the richest country in the world, where we have just finished $1 trillion in tax breaks, about to give more tax breaks. I'm not going to make tax breaks the issue. What I'm saying is there must be a way for us to satisfy the need. We're acknowledging that there's a need, so there must be a way to satisfy this need. And I look forward to working with my friends on all sides of the aisle to satisfy the need. With that said, I will yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to amend.
You have an amendment at the desk?
I do.
We'll pause while the amendment is distributed.
Minute.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Stivers, page 8, line 19, after the semicolon, insert
Without
and.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment removes one data collection requirement from the underlying bill. Currently, homeless service providers collect data for HUD's Homeless Management Information System, HMIS, on individuals who enter the system. This data is used by HUD to inform its policies and provide information on the latest trends in homelessness. The underlying bill had a provision intended to provide HUD with better information about the number of individuals who had experienced traumatic life events. The National Network to End Domestic Violence, which has endorsed the bill, felt that this provision might have an unintended consequence of re-traumatizing events for individuals. At their request, I'm offering an amendment to remove this provision. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I would urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Hearing no other debate, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers. All those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll now pause while the amendment is distributed. This is the Waters Amendment.
I do. I have an
Mr. Chairman,
amendment at
I'd
the
like to
desk.
reserve a point of
This is my
order.
amendment that's been circulated.
I'd like to reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
You want to take a point of order? We speak to the point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Water. At the end of the bill, add the following new section. Section 3, effective date, authorization, and appropriations. A, effective date. The amendments made by Section 2 shall not be effect until the United States Interagency Council on
Without objection, the reading of the
Homelessness-
amendment is dispensed with.
I'd like to reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
A point of order has been reserved.
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the sponsor of the amendment, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to support this legislation, but without any additional funding. I'm concerned that this bill would divert funding away from people with the most acute housing needs, including children and youth that are homeless under the current HUD definition. We shouldn't have to take housing assistance away from someone living on the street in order to give it to someone who is doubled up with family or living temporarily in a motel. That is why my amendment would authorize enough funding for HUD homeless assistance programs to help everyone who is counted as homeless under the new definition. Further, my amendment would ensure that the bill does not go into effect until the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness makes a determination that Congress has appropriated sufficient funding to house everyone who is homeless under the current definitions. I urge all my colleagues to vote for this amendment to send a clear message that we support helping all homeless children and youth as defined under this bill, and that we support the authorization of the funding levels needed to do so. Is this, you said substitute the agency council for HUD? And I don't know when I do that. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to strike U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and replace it with Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Without objection, is Mr. Stivers?
My point of order with their unanimous consent.
Point of order withdrawn. Is there any
Withdrawn.
further
Yep.
debate on the amendment? Seeing no further debate, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor of the gentlelady's amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay.
Recorded
In the
vote is
opinion of the chair, the
requested.
nays have it.
I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Seeing a sufficient number have raised their hands, a recorded vote is now ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there any further amendment or discussion? There being no further amendments, recorded votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motion to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 2069. The clerk will now report the bill, which will be distributed in advance, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2069, to provide priority under certain federal assisted housing programs to assist youth who are aging out of foster care and for other purposes. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act of 2017. Section 2, definition of family. Subparagraph A, Section 3B3 of the United States Housing Act of 1937, 42 U.S.C. 1436A-B3A is amended. 1, in the first sentence, A, by striking...
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes himself to offer the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Copies of the amendment have already been distributed and are on the dais. The clerk will report.
Amendment in nature, substitute offered by
Without objection,
Mr.
the amendment is
Duffy.
considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself now for 5 minutes. I first want to thank Representative Turner from Ohio for introducing H.R. 2069, the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act. This is another great bipartisan bill with 17 Republicans and 17 Democrat co-sponsors. Some of those co-sponsors are on our very own committee here today. I want to recognize and thank Mr. Hill, Mr. MacArthur, Mr. Meeks, Ms. Moore for the work to ensure that our foster kids have access to housing when they age out of foster care. While Mr. Turner is not a member of this committee and cannot bring the bill forward, we have held a hearing in our subcommittee on H.R. 2069, and he has been very engaged in the process, in the modifications, in the tweaks, and the bipartisan nature of bringing folks together to make sure we could have both Democrat and Republican support. I've heard feedback at the hearing. Mr. Turner was inclined to make the changes to the bill that we think will bring bipartisan support, and it came from that subcommittee hearing. The main change we wanted to address was the concern over work requirements. I believe he has addressed those issues, so there shouldn't be any valid reason, I think, for members to be in opposition to this bill. So let's first talk about the problem. In fiscal year 2015, the Department of Health and Human Services estimated that nearly 21,000 of our youth were emancipated from foster care. Now, emancipation is the term used when a youth turns 18 or they age out of foster care. Now, to me, helping those aging out of foster care is a perfect example of how we can potentially address homelessness before someone becomes homelessness, before it becomes a way of, that's not a way of life, but becomes a problem in someone's life. The unfortunate truth is that these kids have had the federal government actually as their parents, as their guardian. It is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure that homelessness doesn't become the first experience our foster kids have upon emancipation. Abandoning foster kids at their time of need is nothing short of federally sponsored homelessness. Some of the members here will claim that we're taking vouchers away from others. They'll say that we just need to spend more money and create more vouchers. They'll ask us how we can prioritize our foster children over others. The fact is that foster youth transitioning into adulthood, they need our help. Nearly 1 in 5 foster youth initially surveyed at age 17 reported that by age 19 they had experienced homelessness. Again, nearly 1 in 5 foster youth initially surveyed at age 17 reported that by age 19 they had experienced homelessness, 20%. As many as 37% of foster care alumni in general have experienced homelessness. 1 in 4 chronically homeless adults is a former foster child. We have to think creatively about how we can stop this problem before it arises. This bill will help by categorizing foster children as a top 3 priority if they apply for housing assistance 6 months prior to aging out of the foster care program. But we aren't just giving them a free pass to the front of the line. As I've said, we have to invest in the programs that are working. That is why Mr. Turner has also linked this legislation to the goals of the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which has proven to help the poverty-stricken become independent and ultimately open up housing to others. Listen, this is not a silver bullet, but it's an attempt to address poverty in our children before they become homeless. And so, again, in short, we have kids in foster care. We have the federal government as a parent or a guardian. We have an incredibly high rate of those young individuals becoming homeless. Let's give them a bridge. Let's give them a bridge to success, to upward mobility, and you do that by offering them a home. And I think this is a good bill. It's a thoughtful bill, and I just want to note that though we might always not be bipartisan in Congress or on this committee, this is one where Mr. Turner heard the complaints and the concerns from across the aisle and has gone to lengths to address those concerns, and I think it's a bill that should be palatable to both Republicans and Democrats and help a group of young people who are in significant need. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time. For what purpose does the gentle lady from California seek
I move
recognition?
to strike the last word.
The gentle lady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2069 is just as irresponsible as the previous bill and certainly represents a worthy goal to provide housing assistance for foster youth aging out of care. However, instead of providing increased funding to do so, this bill would once again prioritize one group over hundreds of thousands of people who are also in need and waiting for assistance. Further, this bill would impose work requirements on foster youth who receive housing through this new federal preference. Mr. Chairman, we have never imposed work requirements as a condition of receiving federal housing assistance because there is a broad recognition that the lack of housing itself is a barrier to employment, and therefore making work a condition of housing can be incredibly harmful and counterproductive. Even though Secretary Carson and the Trump administration is seeking to impose work requirements on all HUD-assisted tenants, there's no evidence that work requirements actually result in people increasing their income. If we're serious about helping foster youth, let's get serious about providing the funding to do so. And let's do away with harmful work requirements that do nothing but promote false stereotypes about people who need housing assistance and put them at risk of eviction and homelessness. Allow me, if I may, just to say that for those young people who are aging out in foster care programs and assistance, we need to do more while they are still in foster care to ensure that they are getting educated, that they are not only getting educated but are trained for jobs. Let's give job assistance to them. Let's do everything possible to make sure that they're able to be independent and that they're able to take care of themselves and have decent and safe housing, and that they're able to basically look forward to a decent life. This is not the way to do it. Again, you're trying to take what resources we already have, forget about the people who are waiting, forget about the families with children, forget about the veterans, forget about those who have been looking forward to getting some help from their government because they have no jobs, oftentimes, and no housing, and somehow prioritize those children or those young people who are coming out of foster care. We should care about all of them. We should not be pitting one against the other. We should not be talking about why one homeless person is less important than another homeless person or more important than another homeless person. This is ridiculous. Of course we should be helping these young people who age out. Of course we should be helping veterans. Of course we should be helping families. Of course we should be helping children. And I don't know why Mr. Turner or anybody else would think that this is the kind of public policy that makes good sense, that this is the kind of public policy that would serve all of those people in need. I would simply ask my colleagues to vote no on this bill, and for those who have considered it, I understand why you empathize and sympathize with those young people who are aging out. I get that. And you know, we see them here in programs, et cetera. But also, next week, somebody will come with the bill and say that the veterans are not prioritized properly. And someone else will come and say the disabled are not getting taken care of properly. And someone else will come here and say, well, you know, we have families with children who should be prioritized over these children that you're trying to identify who are without mothers and fathers or families. So this doesn't make good sense. What makes good sense is that we step up and we provide the funding that is necessary to deal with the crisis in America. This is unconscionable. And shame on all of us for not being able to deal with those poor people out on the street, under these park benches, sleeping on the freeways and highways. And this is not going to help anything or anybody in the way that you're attempting to do it. And I would ask, despite the fact that you may have a philosophy on the opposite side of the aisle, to reduce the spending in government, to get rid of programs that are supported by government, to basically dismantle government, even though you work in it and you get paid every month or so. I would ask you to forget about that philosophy as it relates to the homeless, and let's do something real. Let's do something that shows we have compassion. Let's do something to show that we have thought this through and that it makes good sense for us to take on homelessness as a priority issue in the Congress of the United States of America. And I yield back what time I still don't have.
You do not have. The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
As he strikes the last word.
Yeah, as I do move to strike the last word, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that, Mr. Chairman. But to my colleague from California, it is about effectiveness. It's about how do we effectively use hardworking taxpayers' dollars that they have sent in to this government. And there have been a use and an abuse and an inefficiency that has been there. And so forgive those of us on this side of the aisle to trying to find a way to maximize the effectiveness of those tax dollars to make sure that as many people as possible are helped. My background is housing. I was a licensed realtor. My family has been in construction, and we have seen it for three generations. My fourth generation is working in the family business now. There's nothing more important than the opportunity for people to have housing. And that's why we are trying to do this, to make sure that there is a safety net, but to also make sure that there is an opportunity for those folks to gain their dignity oftentimes in many ways. And so I know that that's the philosophy that we're talking about. And so, Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield the time to you.
I appreciate the gentleman from Michigan yielding. Listen, we're talking about kids who are in foster care. And sometimes our government doesn't work well. We have agencies and bureaucracies that don't talk to each other, that don't work together. And I would just note that the ranking member made a complaint about work requirements. And we heard the complaint. And that's why Mr. Turner had an amendment to this bill. We listened to you, we heard you, and we fixed it because we wanted your support. And so what we've done is said, no work requirements, you don't have to work, but over the first 30 months, we're gonna ask you to engage in education. We're gonna ask you to engage in workforce development. You don't have to get a job, but you should do some things that are gonna help improve your prospects in your career. This is about making government work. And I don't know, I remember when I was 18, I have an 18-year-old daughter, they don't maybe know the ways of the world. Maybe they're not the sharpest knives in the drawer. Maybe that's not the right phrase to say about our 18-year-olds, but let's help them out. Let's help them figure out how they can navigate the system when they go from child welfare into the housing authority. Let's connect them. Let's not drop them.
Will the gentleman yield?
I won't, and it's not time. It's the time from the gentleman's time from Michigan. But I just want to note the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare sent a letter, and they in essence said we're talking about 2,129 kids a year, a couple thousand kids a year that we could help. I mean, this makes sense, and you can't say that we have government that doesn't work. We don't want to fix the way government works more effectively and efficiently. All we want to do is just spend more money. Well, I guess I don't think our government always spends money well. And so let's make sure we can target and use our resources in an effective way to help the most vulnerable. And this is what this legislation does. And I would just also note that, again, there is an amendment. There is not work requirements per the amendment, contrary to the ranking member's comments. But I want to go to a letter that was written by Karen Bass, Congresswoman from California's 37th District. This came to us yesterday, and in the second paragraph, she says, in my opinion, foster youth should be treated the same as their parented peers, including having a safe place to live as they transition to adulthood. Most parents provide their children with a safety net should they fall on hard times, particularly in their young childhood. Additionally, most parents would never finance their young adults' housing without some conditions, such as going to work or school. Foster youth should not be treated any differently. H.R. 2069 does just that. So yes, as a parent, if your 18 or 19-year-old says, hey, just give me money, mom and dad, and pay for my house, I'm not going to do anything, the parents might go, that doesn't really work for me. Maybe we should actually have you get some job training or workforce development. And the government as a parent is saying the same thing that all of us as parents say to our kids. We're no different. And that's why Karen Bass, one of our fellow members, is saying, hey, this makes sense. We're just not throwing money. We're saying there's some responsibility with the help that we give you. In addition to a parental safety net, also we're providing a safety net to these foster children.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Turner, great bill and great bipartisanship.
Just
I yield back.
reclaiming my time being the father of a 20-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a soon-to-be 18-year-old, their decision-making may not be as refined as it should be and will be at some point or another.
That was probably a better way to put it than I did.
Yes, it was. But the point being that the guidance that can and should be provided to kids as they grow into adulthood is a responsibility that we all have, and I support the bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back also time he does not have. Who seeks recognition?
No, you have to go to him.
The gentleman from Colorado seeks recognition for what purpose?
Move to strike the last word. Just a couple
Gentleman's
comments,
recognized
and
for 5 minutes.
I'll yield to the ranking member. I look at Mr. Stiver's bill and this bill a little bit differently. This bill, I really do think pits one homeless category against another, and I don't like that, and I'm not going to support this particular bill. The other expands the definition of homelessness, and I think the real question for me is, in expanding that, have I diluted the money, the budget that's available to help homeless people? And probably the answer is today, yeah. But do I think that Democrats are going to be in charge come January next year of the House of Representatives? Do I think Democrats will win the White House in 2020? I think so. Certainly no slam dunk, but then we're going to have the opportunity to change these budget priorities. And instead of doing big tax cuts of $1 trillion, $500 billion or more for the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations, we can, with that expanded base that Mr. Stivers is suggesting in his bill, help a lot of people. My wife's a teacher, high school teacher. My sister's a junior high school teacher. And they talk about the kids that they see too often. And so for me, I look at these two bills differently. I do think there's a pitting of one category of homelessness against another in Mr. Duffy's bill, or Mr. Turner's bill, or whoever's it is. But the other, I don't mind expanding the base or the definition, because I want to be in a position to help all those people. And I think we're going to be there come January of next year. With that, I yield to the gentlelady from California.
Well, I appreciate, Mr. Perlmutter, the thought that you're giving to both of these bills. I think it is time for us to stand up at the moment that we are presented with this kind of proposition, where the Republicans think that they can say they're doing something about a problem, such as homelessness, and not talk about resources to go along with it. They're in the cutting business. They cut budgets. They deny resources to the most vulnerable people in our society. So I don't want to try to figure out and work with them on how we can get this done without the resources, and not even counting on the fact that we can correct what they have done or make sense out of what they have done when we get elected. When we are confronted with this kind of mess, this kind of business, we need to say what it is and call it for what it is. And again, it's the Republicans, one more time, trying to make it look as if they're doing something, but not willing to spend money, and confronting us with the kind of budget cuts in every category that would help the most vulnerable people in our society, and expect us to go along with it. I don't go along with this. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to try and work with them on this. They are wrong. They're undermining, again, the most vulnerable people in our society. They're going to come along and they're going to make excuses for why we should change priorities. They're going to talk about how much they love the veterans in our society. They're going to talk about how much they love the seniors and the handicapped, but they're not willing to spend any money to make sure that these people have a decent quality of life. And so I oppose both of the bills. And I say to them, put the money where your mouths are. Put the money up to take care of all of these homeless people, whether they are foster care young people aging out, or whether they are families with children, or whether they are children without families. We have to spend the money to deal with what is a crisis in America, what is shameful in America, what we should all be concerned about, and that is that people are sleeping and dying on the streets of America. And you know, it's very interesting how you, Mr. Duffy, and others will talk about your children and how proud you are to be fathers. Well, we're all proud to be mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and all of that. But let's not compare our lives with the lives of the people on the street. We're living a hell of a lot better than these homeless people that we're talking about. And in the Aging Out program, it should be part of the program to help prepare them for jobs, for a career, support them getting the education. That's nothing new. It shouldn't be anything new. And so I yield back the balance of my time.
Reclaiming my time that I don't have, I'll yield back to the chair.
The gentleman yields back time he does not have. Who seeks recognition? Who seeks recognition?
Green from Texas.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Green from Texas seeks recognition.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Like the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I shall not use 5 minutes. But I do believe that by supporting this legislation, we will provide a means by which those who are apparently supporting homelessness, but not really, because it's not being funded, we'll provide a means by which they can go out and say, I'm doing a lot to help the homeless. I'm really fighting to make sure that homeless people who age out of foster care will have some assistance. I'm really fighting to expand the definition of what homelessness is so that we can help everybody. And I don't know whether that will be effective or not, but I do know that that kind of messaging is antithetical to the truth. The truth is, if you don't fund it, it becomes an unfunded mandate. My friends on the other side have been absolutely, totally, and completely opposed to unfunded mandates. Not all, but most of them. And this is nothing but an unfunded mandate. But it's one of the unfunded mandates that carries with it a lot of pain, because all we're doing is taking a finite pool of money that already exists, and now we're going to spread it among additional persons who need help. This is so shameful. And we're at a point now where the help that we need to cause this to be presented as it is the media. If the media doesn't carry this message and the truth about it, there will be people who are going to claim they really did a great job to help the homeless. So I can only say that I hope that the truth about what's happening here today will be exposed. Many people rely on the fact that the truth does not make it to the masses. This is an opportunity for the media to do its job and expose what's going on here. At the hearings, we've not had testimony indicating that we have a surplus of funds for those who are already in need of homeless shelters, in need of homeless aid in various ways. We've not had testimony about a surplus of dollars. We've not had testimony indicating that if we do this, there will be enough money to cover these programs as well as the others. As a matter of fact, the people who are in the business of monitoring these activities, they are telling us that we need more money for the people who are already in need. They're telling us that we need to do more to try to satisfy the needs of persons who are living under bridges, literally living under bridges, literally sleeping on the ground. They're telling us that the programs we have are not funded properly. And because they're not funded properly, saying that you're not using the money effectively does not mean that somehow you are not taking the taxpayer dollars and using them as they should be used. Just saying that we've got to be more effective. That's not going to change the fact that we're not funding these programs properly. At some point, we've got to tell the truth, and it's got to get to the masses of people in this country. Because this is a shell game, a shameful shell game. Shameful. The way we are presenting this as aid to people who are going to somehow acquire the additional benefits that are not there. They're not there. I don't know how we can ever say to the public, those of us who care about people who are homeless, that this somehow is going to help all of the people who are in need of help. It just won't happen. I'll yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I find this debate to absolutely be surreal. This is about priorities. And what I'm hearing from some of my friends on the other side of the aisle is, you know what? I didn't quite get my way on the budget, so therefore, I'm not going to help the children. Okay, a budget is about priorities. Legislation is about priorities. This bill and the prior bill are about priorities. Prioritizing homeless children, prioritizing those who are leaving, children who are leaving foster care. That's what this is about. And we look at the category and those who will so vociferously and passionately speak about the plight of the homeless. There are many who are homeless because they're down on their luck. They've lost their job. They've been laid off because they have received something less than economic opportunity. And now we see the greatest economy in most people's lifetimes, courtesy of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, courtesy of the regulatory agenda of the Trump administration. We are seeing almost the lowest unemployment in 50 years. That's the best housing program. For the category of those who are down on their luck, there is no better housing program than a good job leading to a good career in a growing economy, and we have the most robust economy, and yet my friends on the other side of the aisle have fought us every step of the way. Every step of the way. There are less people facing homelessness because of economic deprivation due to the efforts of President Trump and a Republican Congress. So again, we're also seeing minority unemployment, lowest since they've kept records. Lowest since they've kept records. And so this has been a committee, this has been a Congress that has been focused on ensuring that people do have housing opportunities. And now we're faced with a simple question of prioritization of all those who face the plight of homelessness. Should children be prioritized? Our side of the aisle says yes. Of all the vulnerable populations, this is the most vulnerable. This is the least responsible. The least responsible. They didn't break up the family. They didn't suffer from substance abuse. And so again, I just find this somewhat surreal that we would not prioritize children in the debate of aid for the homeless. And so again, some items we can work on a bipartisan basis. I was hoping this would be one of them. Clearly, it is not. It is disappointing, but I think people should see very clearly what this debate is certainly about. And I yield back the balance of my time. For what purposes does ranking member seek
I have an
recognition?
amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
My amendment would replace the text of this bill.
We're allowing the amendment to be distributed.
All right.
Mr. Chairman,
What purposes does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
is there a point of order? We haven't.
Point of order is reserved.
Out of order because that program is not in our jurisdiction.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute offered by Ms. Waters. Strike all after the amendment.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would replace the text of this bill with the text of my bill, H.R. 5833, the Expanding Housing Opportunities for Foster Youth Act of 2018, which offers a much better approach to providing housing assistance for foster youth aging out of care. Instead of taking vouchers from others in need, my bill would authorize enough funding for the Family Unification Program to provide a voucher for every foster youth that needs one. The Family Unification Program is tailored to the needs of foster youth, including the coordination of services from child welfare agencies. Further, this program does not impose any work requirements on recipients. I know that Mr. Duffy said that had all been taken care of, but under this program, they coordinate services from the child welfare agencies. So I would urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes, gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
I withdraw my point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is withdrawn. Chair will recognize himself. Number one, again, unfortunately, I think this amendment probably misses the point. There is a very, very small number of PHAs that participate in this FUP, Family Unification Program. I think if I have the facts right, it's 168 out of the 2,200. So again, I believe we are looking at a question of prioritization. I think we are also looking at a question of effectiveness. And I would certainly be far more interested in entertaining an amendment if I found that the money was coming out of, say, CDBG. If we really want to show what a priority is, I would say this program may be a greater priority than CDBG. If that amendment is presented, then I would probably look upon it a little bit more favorably. Right now, the issue before us is one of prioritization. The other side of the aisle says we will not prioritize unless we see greater funds. I consider those to be separate issues, and I will yield to the ranking member.
Well, I thank you very much. But if you think for 1 minute that we would take money from CDBG in order to fund a program where I have shown where it should be funded and could be funded, the Family Unification Program, then, Mr. Chairman, you're not thinking wisely. Of course, we won't take money from CDBG.
Well, reclaiming my time, I did not assume that you would, but I certainly wished in a public forum to offer that opportunity. We have gone through this before. It's not always how much money you spend, it's how you spend the money. And so we have seen that the HUD budget continues to grow and grow and grow, and yet we still have a homeless problem. So it's not always how much money you throw at a program that matters. It has a lot to do, again, with prioritization. It has a lot to do with effectiveness. And no, I have not been a particular fan of CDBG. We have had hearings before. I have not found it to be a good use of the taxpayer dollar, and I would consider the family unification voucher to be an more important use vis-a-vis CDBG. You don't agree, we've got it on the public record, I get it, that you will not accept it. So anyway, I would just urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, speaking about opportunities, I'm proud to say that earlier this Congress, I wrote a bipartisan letter to the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee on the Appropriations Committee requesting $20 million for the Family Unification Program in fiscal year 2018. And I'm proud to say that those dollars were awarded in the recent omnibus bill passed by Congress and signed into law. This was the first time the Family Unification Program has been allocated any funds from Congress in years. With these funds, the Department of Housing and Urban Development will be able to provide the child welfare system with the resources necessary to prevent family separation due to homelessness and to prevent homelessness among aging out foster youth. Congresswoman Waters' amendment would assure that every youth aging out of foster care would receive a Family Unification Program housing voucher, and I strongly support her amendment and urge my colleagues to support it as well. I yield back unless the ranking member needs more time. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Since we're discussing prioritization, and the chairman mentioned CDBG as a possible source for additional funding for the family unification vouchers, I'll just add that I think prioritization is important, and there's other ways to look at this as well. If we want to make a commitment to additional family unification funding, I think we need to look at the Housing Choice Voucher program in general. This general debate came up in the context of legislation that I offered, the Thrive Act, that would prioritize and provide some additional funding for housing choice vouchers for addiction recovery. And whether it's addiction recovery housing assistance or whether it's foster care housing, I think we need to kind of take a look at our priorities in general when it comes to the Housing Choice Voucher program. What we all know is that the surest way to escape poverty is work. Welfare programs or transfer payments can sometimes alleviate the immediate effects of poverty, but they do not provide low-income people with the tools they need to get out of poverty. And our welfare system should encourage work-capable adults to work or prepare for work in exchange for benefits wherever they can. According to the Congressional Research Service, non-elderly, non-disabled households make up more than 2 million of the 4.5 million households in HUD housing assistance programs, and 44% of those work-capable households reported no annual income. That means that almost 1 million households are receiving housing assistance who are able-bodied and working age but have no income from wages. If we want to prioritize within the context of the Housing Choice Voucher program, if we want to provide additional funding for foster youth and family unification vouchers, what we ought to consider is for those 1 million households receiving housing assistance who are able-bodied and working age but have no income from wages, we ought to require those individuals to work or prepare for work in exchange for those housing benefits. That would free up the resources we need for additional addiction recovery housing services, for additional foster care. And I would just say that because of the booming economy, because of the tax cuts, confidence among low-income Americans has jumped over 11% since February of 2018. That's a good thing. We should celebrate the success of tax cuts, creating more jobs, creating more opportunity. If we truly care about fighting poverty, it shouldn't be about increasing welfare budgets. It should be about creating the opportunities for work. Work is the best way for anyone to escape poverty. And so look, we can have a twofer here. Through work requirements for able-bodied, non-elderly people in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, we can help people escape poverty better, while at the same time, we can free up resources for the most vulnerable, people who can't work, the disabled, the elderly who are on waiting lists right now because we don't have work requirements, and for foster care youth. So let's look at this a little bit more creatively. Let's not say that we're going to repeat the mistakes of the last 40 years in the war on poverty and just continue to deficit spend without effective results. I think if we're truly compassionate, if we're committed to helping foster youth, if we're committed to helping people who have addiction, if we're committed to helping people in poverty, let's focus on what works. And what works is economic growth. What works is giving people skills. What works is giving people upward mobility through the dignity and the blessing of work. Let's use this opportunity to prioritize in the right way. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? If there's no further debate on the amendment, the question.
Green from Texas,
What
Mr. Chairman.
purpose does gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for
And
5
I
minutes.
appreciate comments of Mr. Barr about the value of work. We all believe in the value of work. But a lot of people have other challenges in life. And, you know, in terms of prioritizing our budget, which the chairman and Mr. Barr are talking about, to cut our revenue, the country's revenue, that helps provide the resources for roads and bridges and housing and education, to cut that revenue by $1,500 billion at a minimum, and then talk to us about setting budget priorities and wanting to make sure that this program is effective and that program is effective. I mean, I think the overall HUD budget is about $20 billion. I don't have it in front of me right now, or $50 billion. Just that tax cut alone could fund HUD for decades to come. And to get on a soapbox and tell us that we need to have more effective use of this money when we send huge amounts of money to the richest people in America and say that that'll trickle down to jobs for these people that face other challenges, that's a joke. So, you know, these bills are more specific than this big kind of conversation we're having about the value of work and prioritizing the budget. But let's not forget that these things do cost money. Housing costs money. Job training costs money. A lot of people, to overcome the challenges, need that kind of assistance, and we are shortchanging them terribly in favor of the richest Americans. And I think my friend from Texas, would you like to balance my time?
I accept. Thank you. I greatly appreciate your commentary. We're back to the basic premise that a good many of my colleagues adhere to of the poor can do more with less. And the rich must have more to do more. This whole notion of if you truly care about fighting poverty, you'll support tax cuts for the rich. Tax cuts for the rich will go into the pockets of the rich. They don't trickle down to the people who are living under the bridges. They don't trickle down to the people who need this foster care aid and assistance. Tax cuts for the rich will go to yachts. Tax cuts for the rich don't have to go back into the economy for jobs for others unless you're a yacht builder. It's time for us to avoid this continued philosophical point of view of the poor doing more with less. The poor are just like other people, and they need a hand, not a handout, but a hand. And that's what we've tried to provide with the government's aid and assistance. So I thank you for yielding the time to me, and I assure you that I am supportive of the legislation that Ms. Waters has proposed. It contains the funding necessary to make the programs meaningful. It does more than simply provide an unfunded mandate, which is what my colleagues on the other side are doing, providing another unfunded mandate. People who claim that they are antithetical to unfunded mandates, providing unfunded mandates. So I am absolutely opposed to the bill unless this amendment passes. And I will yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Obviously, we've gotten a little bit off topic here, but I'm going to follow the train off topic. It's amazing that my friends across the aisle are complaining about tax cuts for middle-income families, to low-income families. I mean, if you don't make any income, you didn't get a tax cut. That's true. But if you make any money where you're paying taxes, you got a tax cut. You have more money in your pocket. And contrary to every news report out there, my friends across the aisle say it doesn't help the economy. Look around, whether you're in Texas or Colorado or Wisconsin, there's help wanted signs everywhere. There's more jobs available than people to fill the jobs. Because when you lower taxes and you reduce regulation, amazing things happen whenever you do it. Economies grow. More opportunity, more jobs, and more upward mobility. So no matter how many times that you say tax reform and streamlining government rules and regulations hasn't worked, that's contrary to all the evidence out there and the common sense of every single American who's involved in the American economy. I have an employer in Wisconsin. You can graduate in Wisconsin, they're a Midwestern company, but they're based in Wisconsin. Midwestern company, you graduate from high school, no skills, just graduate from high school. And they'll pay you $16 an hour, full time. And if you actually work the second shift, they'll give you a $2 an hour bonus. So now we're talking $18 an hour. And if you work the weekend, $2 more on top of that. You're pushing $20 an hour as a high school graduate because they're raising the amount they're willing to pay because there's so much competition for labor because of the policies that we've helped implement. And so if we're talking about helping the poorest of the poor, we're helping people. Listen, there's some people who have drug addictions. That's a whole set of problems we got to work on together as an American Congress. There's people who have mental illnesses. That's a problem too we got to figure out. But we have a group of people who have fallen on hard times that don't have those issues, that we have an economy that's roaring, where they can make a good wage and help provide for themselves. That's an American success story. And to try to cast this in a different light is, it's not accurate. When we talk about money for housing, I'm frustrated because we're saying we don't spend any money for housing. There's not enough money. There's money. Well, we're spending $20 billion on Section 8. $20 billion. Now, I'm all right if we have a conversation to say, hey, listen, we've done everything we can to streamline these programs, to make these programs efficient. And once we've done all that of making government work effectively and efficiently with your tax money, and it's not enough, we have to spend more, we can have that conversation. But my friends across the aisle will never talk about how poorly some of the programs are run. They just want to say, keep the poor programs that don't work well, that don't effectively use taxpayer money, and just dump more money into it. Well, I don't buy that argument. I want to make them run well because the better the program is run, the more we help people because we're more efficient with the money. Isn't that what we're trying to do? Is stretch the dollar as far as we can to help as many people as possible? And if you need more, let's have that conversation. One other train off topic is big giveaways and big holes in our budget with tax reform. I don't know if anybody has looked at the receipts into the federal coffers and what's happened. Anybody done that? Now, you would think, based on some of the commentary, after tax reform, the receipts into the federal coffers must have gone down significantly because obviously tax reform, collecting even lower rates, we're collecting less money, right? Au contraire. We're actually bringing in more money to the federal coffers because what happens, like we've argued, is the pie grows, the economy grows. And so if you have a bigger pie, and yes, you might take a little smaller piece of that pie, more money comes in. And there's more pie for everyone to eat. It's great. So I love the arguments, but they don't match up with facts. And the facts are we have a growing economy. We have more job opportunities. We have better wages, more money coming into the federal coffers. And no matter how many times you say it's not working or it hasn't worked, the facts tell a different story. And the folks who are there in my community who have been looking for a pay raise, they're getting it. People are fighting for their labor. And if they don't like their job, they don't like their boss, they don't like the benefit package, they pack up, they leave, and they go down the street, and they'll probably make more money.
Will the
It's given
gentleman
people
yield?
great ability to move and make more cash.
Will the
I
gentleman
yield
yield?
back.
The gentleman has no time to yield. The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Move to strike the last
The gentleman's
word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think a study of history will find that any great civilization collapsed because they spent too much money on the poor. I think you'd have to really struggle to find that that's why Rome or the Ottoman Empire or the Egyptian Empire collapsed, because they spent too much money on the poor. Now, if there is more pie, as my neighbor mentioned, then why would we take our piece and then put it in the freezer? If there's more pie, let more people eat, particularly those who are in difficulty. And, you know, we say in seminary when we're studying stewardship that if you want to know a person's priority, look in their checkbook. You spend based on the things that are really important to you. And I think that one of the things that is important, I think, is dealing with homeless men and women. You know, these are the men and women who become separated from society. And it's not just a social problem. I think it's a reflection of who we are. And my hope is that we understand, if you look at what we've been doing in the last few years and who's really benefiting the most from this deluge of new money coming in, it's certainly not the people who are in the greatest difficulty. I'd like to yield now to the ranking member.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me just say I was sitting here reflecting on a few things. First of all, Mr. Duffy has left. I want to know the name of the company in Wisconsin he's referring to. I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and if his staff is here and they will let him know that I would appreciate knowing that company. Secondly, you know, because this is a Financial Services Committee, we know what the banks and you know, the corporations are doing in America. And I cannot help but reflect with this tax cut, this tax giveaway, this tax scam. Wells Fargo, that basically cheated its clients by creating accounts in their names that they didn't know about, who forced insurance upon clients that did not need the insurance, who already had insurance, is scheduled, already may have received $3.7 billion in tax relief. One of the richest banks in America. And I tell you, I just, I cannot be quiet when I see the disparity, you know, in our country and how the poorest and the least of these are treated, and how we talk about providing some assistance without providing the resources to go along with it. And so I'm offering an amendment, and Ms. Beatty explained the amendment very well and talked about the fact that the Opportunities for Foster Youth Care Act of 2018, which my bill offers a much better approach to providing housing assistance for foster youth aging out of care. So instead of taking vouchers from others in need, my bill would authorize enough funding for the Family Unification Program to provide a voucher for every foster youth that needs one. I don't know how my friends on the opposite side of the aisle can resist that and talk about reprioritizing in a way that would harm some and maybe help others. And so I suppose I'm not going to get support for this amendment from the opposite side of the aisle, but I certainly hope that Mr. Green is correct, that the media is paying attention and these stories will be told correctly about what happened here today on these two bills. And the fact that everybody who says that they want to help the homeless, on this side of the aisle, we want to help them with real resources. On the other side of the aisle, they want to displace some who have the same needs and put others ahead of them, and that does not do anything to reduce the number of homelessness in this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman from Missouri has expired. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the ranking member. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays
I request
appear.
a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion? There being no further amendments, record votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motions to adopt the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, if amended, and to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 5059. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5059 to amend the Homeowners Loan Act with respect to the registration and supervision.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Yes.
The chair has been informed that copies of the amendment have already been distributed and are on the dais. The clerk will report.
Amendment in the nature of substitute offered by Mr. Rothfuss. Strike all after the enacting clause. And
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman and Chairman Duffy for bringing the State Insurance Regulation Preservation Act, or H.R. 5059, to today's markup. I also want to thank my colleague, Representative Joyce Beatty, for her hard work on this issue. I would also like to note that the manager's amendment in the nature of substitute incorporates changes suggested by the Federal Reserve. I appreciate the Fed's constructive feedback, and I was happy to accommodate their requested improvements. This bill is a good example of how solutions-minded members from both sides of the aisle can come together to address a clear problem. H.R. 5059 is a common-sense right regulation bill that calls on the Federal Reserve to tailor the supervision of insurance-focused savings and loan companies. As many of you know, Dodd-Frank bought savings and loan holding companies under the Federal Reserve supervision for the first time. Despite the fact that Dodd-Frank also reaffirmed the state-based model of insurance regulation, a principle that many of us support, the law had the effect of also bringing insurance savings and loan holding companies under the Fed's purview. These are companies that are overwhelmingly engaged in the business of insurance, but also happen to own thrift subsidiaries. These insurance companies are simultaneously regulated by the Fed and the states. The lack of clarity regarding how Fed supervision of these insurers should complement rather than supplant state regulation has led to regulatory inefficiency, duplication of effort, and higher compliance costs. Bank-centric Fed supervision has also been a poor fit for companies that are primarily in the insurance business, and it has not been consistent with the actual risks posed by the ISLHCs. All of this cost and complexity eventually impacts consumers through higher prices and reduced access to services. I should also point out that the burden of duplicative supervision has encouraged a significant number of these insurance companies to get rid of their thrift subsidiaries. Today, fewer than half of the insurance savings and loan holding companies that existed when Dodd-Frank was enacted continue to operate under the same model. In this committee, we often discuss concerns about concentration in the financial sector and access to services. If we are, in fact, concerned about these things, we should pay close attention to what is happening to the ISLHCs. We recently heard testimony from Rick Means, the president and CEO of Shelter Insurance Company. In Means' testimony, he described how Shelter was ultimately driven to close its small bank since Fed supervisory requirements added more than $1 million to their compliance burden. Means wrote that, quote, expensive new federal supervision did nothing to protect consumers and instead worked to reduce competition and deprive consumers of banking options. In a dedicated hearing on this issue earlier this year, we also heard testimony from the CEO of Country Financial, Kurt Bach. His institution previously maintained a small thrift that accounted for less than 1% of the company's total assets. Despite the relatively small size of the thrift, Fed supervision drove 25% of the holding company's compliance costs. This is neither a pro-consumer outcome nor a good use of resources. Our bill addresses this issue by clarifying what is and is not an insurance, savings, and loan holding company. We want to ensure that companies that meet this definition and register with the Fed get relief. We also want to prevent any form of regulatory arbitrage from undermining the safety and soundness of our financial system. H.R. 5059 streamlines regulators' approach to ISLHCs by enacting the following reforms. If an ISLHC has filed a report with another federal or state regulator, the Fed will be required to request that report from the regulator first before requesting the information from the company. This prevents compliance staff from being required to respond to duplicative information requests. H.R. 5059 also requires the Fed to align record-keeping requirements with those imposed by state insurance authorities to avoid duplication. The bill also requires the Fed examinations be conducted to the fullest extent possible in conjunction with state and federal authorities. Again, this will help to reduce unnecessary duplication and conflict. The bill also requires the Fed to craft a supervisory framework that appropriately tailors the supervision of ISLHCs. It then requires a review of existing supervisory guidance to ensure that it is consistent with the new framework. All of these reforms will provide greater regulatory clarity and efficiency and reduce unnecessary compliance burden. In doing so, we can ensure that these companies can continue to serve their customers without sacrificing the safety and soundness of our financial system. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. Before I yield back, I would like to enter letters of support from PCI, NAMIC, the Insurance Coalition, and the Chamber of Commerce into the record.
Without objection.
I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start by thanking my colleague from the other side of the aisle and the sponsor of this bill, Mr. Rothfuss, for his commitment to working on a bipartisan basis throughout this entire process. This bill has come a long way from when it was introduced, and I think this bill reflects input not only from our offices, but from stakeholders, other members' offices, and regulators. I would also like to thank Mrs. Maloney and her staff, who were critical in helping us to get the language that is reflected in the amendment in the nature of a substitute, in which I believe will be supported hopefully by many members on both sides of the aisle. This bill, with the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, as you've heard earlier, in the manager's amendment, simply seeks to right-size the excessive burden of regulation placed on insurance, savings, and loan holding companies compared to the risks they pose to financial stability. None of these companies have ever been designated by the Financial Stability Oversight Council as posing a risk to the financial stability of the United States economy, yet they are facing similar regulations by the federal government as they were, all because of the way they are structured. There is no reason, in my opinion, why a smaller insurance company like Ohio-based Westfield Insurance Company should face more regulations than some of the largest insurance companies in the country due to the fact that they have a small depository institution. Or why a company like Nationwide Insurance, a company based in the 3rd Congressional District of Ohio, which has around $250 billion in assets and a $7 billion bank, should be treated by the Federal Reserve like a $250 billion bank holding company. The regulation of insurance is different from the regulation of banks, and the Federal Reserve's supervisory framework must reflect this important difference. The Federal Reserve has historically never regulated insurance until recently. Within the past 10 years, when Congress transferred the regulatory authority over these insurance savings and loan holding companies over to the feds. By contrast, our state insurance regulators have regulated this country's insurance system for nearly 150 years. Insurance saving and loan holding companies are regulated by their state insurance regulators, the Federal Reserve, and the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. To be clear, the bill does not remove the Federal Reserve's authority to regulate these companies. It merely requires the feds to use their existing authority to tailor their bank-centric regulations to the unique activities of insurance. I believe the feds has a role to play in supervision of these companies, and the cost of an insurance company owning a depository institution is an extra burden of federal regulation. However, this cost of admission cannot be so high that it forces companies to debank. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, and the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for their fine work on this legislation. For years, the federal government has slowly expanded its jurisdiction to matters that have historically been left to the states. From healthcare to education, the federal government's presence has grown larger and larger. This bill attempts to restore regulatory balance and ensure that the proper authority, in this instance, the state insurance commissioners, can continue to do the job they've done for well over 100 years. In a pre-Dodd-Frank world, there were more than 30 insurance savings and loan holding companies that owned insurance depository institutions. Federal Reserve supervision of these institutions has driven insurance companies to close their banks. That list includes Shelter Insurance, headquartered just outside my district in Columbia, Missouri. In the wake of Dodd-Frank and the dawn of Federal Reserve supervision of insurance, Shelter executives said it was simply no longer cost-effective to run a bank. This was a profitable, well-run bank that the government basically put out of business. Mr. Rothfuss and Ms. Beatty have introduced legislation that would mandate more tailored supervision for insurance holding companies subject to Federal Reserve oversight. And I think we've talked about this in various committee meetings before, that the importance of tailoring the regulations to the entity that you're overseeing is extremely important. Otherwise, it's a square peg in a round hole, and it doesn't work. The legislation would require the federal government to streamline examination procedures and better coordinate with state insurance regulators. To be clear, the legislation doesn't end Federal Reserve supervision. It merely directs the Fed to better coordinate with the states and develop standards that are suitable for insurers. I understand the gentleman from Pennsylvania and the gentlelady from Ohio have worked with each other and with the Federal Reserve to address various concerns. They are both to be commended for their efforts to work across the aisle and with the regulators. H.R. 5059 is a common-sense solution to federal overreach and a step towards reduction of bureaucratic redundancy. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I would be glad to yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I guess I can make it short and say ditto. I also want to compliment the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the gentlelady from Ohio, for working together on this. Again, it's very important to note that the Fed will continue to have a supervisory role, but it shouldn't be totally duplicative of a system of state-based insurance regulation that is already working. And what is most important is the Fed will still be able to set the necessary capital standards of these insurance savings and loan holding companies. And anything we can do to make them more competitive, to ensure that we have effective regulation, but streamlined regulation, will allow there to be greater competition in the marketplace, a more extensive group of services and products to the customer base. And again, we know that Dodd-Frank reaffirmed our state-based system of insurance, but with the passage of time, it could be that maybe the details weren't quite perfect, and I think that this particular legislation, bipartisan piece of legislation, helps achieve the balance that is needed to be achieved. And again, I compliment them on their work. I yield back to the gentleman from Missouri, who I assume yields
I yield back to the chairman.
Yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to commend Ms. Beatty, working with Mr. Rothfuss, for the time and effort that she's put into this legislation. On several occasions, Ms. Beatty has used committee hearings with relevant Fed officials or outside experts to ask questions about the Fed supervision of insurance savings and loan holding companies to better understand the issues and concerns with the current framework and her legislative proposal to modify it. In fact, just last week, I listened to Ms. Beatty, engaged Federal Reserve Chairman Powell on this bill, and while I will note that he did express concerns with the legislation, I also heard him commit to working with her on improvements. I was very encouraged by the chairman's commitment and understanding of the issue, including the importance of the Federal Reserve's prudential regulation, but also of appropriate tailoring. So I would also like to note that the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered today, together with the additional manager's amendment, marks a dramatic improvement to the bill as introduced and calls for a more thoughtful approach to tailoring examination and supervision of insurance savings and loan holding companies. And so, despite the continuing concerns about the legislation today, even as amended, I think the issue does warrant a further discussion and examination. Ms. Beatty, if you would engage in a brief colloquy with me, I would like to ask, will you work with me to continue in the dialogue that has already been started with the Fed to answer my outstanding questions about how we should appropriately tailor supervision of these firms and how we can further refine the language so that we can absolutely ensure that there are no unintended consequences?
To the ranking member, of course I'll do that. I'll commit to continue further discussions and engagement in this work. And thank you for your comments and your interest in making this better.
Well, thank you so very much, and I think we can continue to work together to further perfect the bill and allay any remaining concerns that members may have with this approach before it goes to the floor. So I think that if we work on it by the time we get to Rules Committee, I think we can have worked out all of the concerns. And let me just say this. I was hopeful in the final analysis that the commitment from the feds, as articulated by Mr. Powell, would have been enough for us to say, well, perhaps we don't need a bill. But as I understand it, the insurance companies do not feel as if enough progress has been made, even though there have been commitments in the past to work on this issue. I think they do recognize that some work has been done, but more needs to be done. And so I believe that changing the Fed supervision, a system of supervision as envisioned by Dodd-Frank, is something that we must take into consideration and we must be careful about. But I am committed to working on this bill so that we can satisfy the concerns of the insurance companies and the work that they're doing with their banks. Some of the work that some of the banks are specializing in, I think, is extremely important. I like the one insurance company whose bank is dedicated to veterans. I like another one that's dedicated to retirement income and helping workers and seniors to plan in such a way that their lives will be basically taken care of and supported with income that they have helped to save and invest and to grow in their declining years. So I'm committed to trying to work this out, and I appreciate, Ms. Beatty, all of the time and attention that you have given to it, and the work that we have done and will do to make sure that we get something done. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes gentlemen from North Carolina seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman for yielding, and I want to thank my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for his leadership on this important piece of legislation. I strongly support H.R. 5059, the State Insurance Regulation Preservation Act, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the bill. I firmly support this state-based model of insurance regulation and believe it is a gold standard for consumers and consumer protection. It is simply the best in the world. Members on both sides of the aisle would agree that, and this principle was even reaffirmed in Dodd-Frank, the state-based insurance regulation model is so worthy of protection that we have to look for and make legislative fixes when necessary to protect it. In that vein, Congress must fix this specific provision of Dodd-Frank as it pertains to savings and loan holding companies. These companies were brought under the Fed's purview and the enactment of Dodd-Frank, creating a certain gray area that will be fixed under H.R. 5059. This simple bill would make sure that the Fed's oversight component would complement our state-based model rather than have them overtake and supplant it. This bill brings much-needed clarity to this area of insurance, and I urge support and adoption. Once again, I applaud Mr. Rothfuss for his bipartisan leadership on this important issue. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I support this bill, which is a good faith effort to tailor the Fed's supervision of insurance holding companies and will increase the safety and soundness. The Fed is the prudential regulator for all holding companies that own depository institutions, such as thrifts. Most thrift holding companies all look the same. They're companies set up specifically to own a thrift and do not much more than owning the thrift. But there is a small number of thrift holding companies that are actually very different. The holding company itself is an insurance company, and as such, the insurance company is already regulated by the states, which are the primary insurance regulators in our country, and this bill recognizes and reaffirms that role. Of course, even though these insurance holding companies are already regulated by the states, the Fed still should regulate them separately because the Fed is focused on the safety and soundness of the entire holding company, including the thrift subsidiary, which the state regulators are not focused on. It is thereby a loophole that this bill closes. But insurance holding companies have a very different risk profile than normal thrift holding companies that the Fed regulates, because they are really just insurance companies that happen to own a thrift, rather than holding companies whose only business is owning a thrift. And so the Fed's supervision of these insurance holding companies needs to be tailored specifically to the unique risks and activities of insurance companies, which is exactly what this bill would require the Fed to do. This will actually lead to more robust supervision of these insurance holding companies because it will force the Fed to look for risks that are unique to insurers, which they otherwise would not be looking for in examinations. At first, I had very serious concerns with the original version of this bill, which would have prevented the Fed from supervising insurance holding companies unless they were already in trouble and had already breached their minimum capital requirements. Safety and soundness regulators need to be able to act and to identify potential risks beforehand, well before a company gets in trouble and is running out of capital. And I am very pleased that the substitute amendment takes an entirely new approach to this problem by maintaining all the necessary supervisory authority for the Fed by requiring the Fed to simply tailor its supervision of insurance holding companies to the unique risks that insurers face. So I want to applaud Ms. Beatty and Mr. Rothfuss for their very, very hard work on this bill, and I thank them for responding to the concerns that I had, and I believe that the overhaul reflects the concerns that I and others have, So I strongly support the bill. I believe it increases safety and soundness, and it is something we should uniformly, in a bipartisan way, support, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I especially want to thank our colleague, Mr. Rothfuss, for his work on this bill. Mr. Rothfuss, I've been impressed with his work and his ability to reach across the aisle, find solutions to problems that have lingered, and this is just another example of it. He's a great member, and I think this is a great bill. H.R. 5059 deals with the problem that despite the fact that Dodd-Frank reaffirmed the state-based model of insurance regulation, which is a principle that committee members from both parties support, the law had the effect of also bringing insurance, savings, and loan holding companies under the Fed's purview. These are companies that are overwhelmingly engaged in the business of insurance, but also happen to own thrift subsidiaries. This bill is an important piece of tailoring supervision and regulation of insurance companies rather than attempting to mold them into a world of bank-centric oversight. The Fed's expertise is in the business of banking rather than insurance, and it has been a difficult process to find an appropriate balance to the regulation of ISLHCs. H.R. 5059 allows Congress to weigh in on the relationship between the Fed and the state supervisory role for these insurers. The bill's purpose is only to curtail duplicative federal regulation of holding companies that are primarily insurance underwriters. For those that worry about financial instability, the bill does not remove the ability of the Fed to act on safety and soundness grounds. Despite the fact that the traditional business of insurance should not pose systemic risks, the Fed retains a tailored supervisory role over these entities, the one that recognizes the primary role of the state insurance regulators. This is a great solution. I applaud my colleague and ask if anyone would like additional time. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the chair and the ranking member, and I also would compliment my colleagues. I do believe that the measured approach that the ranking member has proposed is something that merits consideration. And as a result, I'm leaning toward supporting the legislation. I do, however, also want to make this comment about the Fed regulating insurance companies. The Fed didn't get into the regulation of insurance company haphazardly, capriciously, and arbitrarily. There was a company called AIG, and AIG was significantly involved in the downturn that took place in 2008. And I do believe that it was appropriate for us to give consideration to safety and soundness because of the way the AIG company performed. Without going into a long story, I think that there is room for improvement, but I don't want us to forget why Dodd-Frank imposed the regulations on insurance companies that we have, or put the Fed in a position to impose regulations to the extent that it does. But I am leaning toward supporting the legislation at hand. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
The gentleman yields back.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause while the amendment is distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Rothfuss. Page 1.
Without objection, the
line nine.
reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
I again want to thank Representative Beatty and the Federal Reserve staff for their constructive feedback on this legislation. Through the course of improving this bill, all parties have acted in good faith to make progress. This manager's amendment incorporates suggested edits provided by the Fed that will strengthen the bill and make it easier to implement. Crucially, the manager's amendment clarifies certain definitions, and it adopts the elongated implementation timeline requested by the Fed. I ask that my colleagues agree to this amendment, and I yield back. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption of the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 5036. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5036 to establish an independent financial technology task force.
Without objection, the
provide-
bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I have been informed that copies of the amendment have already been distributed and are on the dais. The clerk will report.
Amendment in nature, a substitute offered by Mr. Budd. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman for yielding, and I'm honored to present my amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 5036, the Financial Technology Protection Act, before this committee today. Mr. Chairman, we know that criminals use digital currencies through darknet markets and to monetize cyber attacks. And we also know that there is documented evidence that terrorists are increasingly using these currencies. The RAND Corporation has some good supporting evidence on this as well. The federal government has to be one step ahead of the illicit actors in this new space, and that's what H.R. 5036 will do. Specifically, my legislation will do the following things to help make sure the United States stays ahead of this problem. First, it establishes the Independent Financial Technology Task Force to combat terrorism and illicit financing, whose goal is to improve coordination between private and public sectors on digital currency, terror strategy, and to combat illicit use. From my perspective, industry and the federal government should be coming together to find best practices and solutions to stop this new terrorist funding threat. Second, the ANS contains language from H.R. 5227, the Preventing Rogue and Foreign Actors from Evading Sanctions Act, introduced by my friend Mark Meadows of North Carolina, and supported by the Coin Center. This language directs the Treasury Department to develop a strategy that identifies and describes the potential uses of virtual currencies and other related emerging technologies by states, non-state actors, and foreign terrorist organizations to evade sanctions, finance terrorism, or launder monetary instruments and threaten United States national security. Again, the development of a national strategy to combat illicit use strikes me and my co-lead as common sense. Therefore, we are excited to have it added to the bill and to have Mr. Meadows' support. Also, the Budd Lynch legislation establishes a targeted rewards program for information leading to the capture of terrorists or illicit actors involved with terror digital financing networks. The government should be encouraging individuals with knowledge of illicit use of virtual currencies to come forward through the offerings of rewards for successful convictions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, our legislation establishes the FinTech Leadership and Innovation and Financial Intelligence Program, which will be used for grants and rewards in the FinTech space for ideas and programs to combat terrorist use of digital currencies. These technologies would be open access and open source. Experts in the private sector can track illicit use of these currencies and perhaps do a better job of leveraging their talent to create tools and programs through the FinTech Leadership and Financial Intelligence Program. We need to give them tools to try, and that's exactly what this bill does. Here's the bottom line, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5036 is legislation that sparks private sector innovation to deal with terror and illicit financing when it comes to virtual currencies. And I think that Congress should be promoting programs and technologies that give industry the tools they need to save their technology and industry from illicit use, and hopefully from further regulation down the road. So I want to close by thanking the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for his work and assistance on this important legislation. I also want to thank the minority staff for their input and feedback on ways to tighten this bill up and to make it better, which I appreciate, and it's reflected in our ANS. And finally, I cannot thank the majority staff enough for all their input on this bill and their ideas to improve it. Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of my amendment to H.R. 5036 in support for the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks the recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose is the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And very thankful that the chairman has allowed us to bring forth H.R. 5036, the Financial Technology Protection Act, before this committee during today's markup. I'd also like to thank my colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for working with our office on this important legislation. This has truly been a bipartisan effort. I know that sometimes Congress is accused of being highly partisan, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of cooperation, but I'll say that this subcommittee on terrorism and illicit finance has been a wonderful exception to that general perception. And I want to thank Mr. Budd for his cooperation, but also I think it starts at the top, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Pierce, the gentleman from New Mexico, and also Ed Perlmutter, our ranking member on this subcommittee, gentleman from Colorado. They really set the tone of cooperation, and it runs through every bit of work we do in that subcommittee, and I'm very proud to be a contributing member. Throughout my time in Congress, I've worked with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to cut off the flow of funding to terrorists and other illicit actors. This work has taken me to Jordan, where we worked with King Abdallah and the central bank there to help that nation establish its own financial intelligence unit. We also worked to make sure legislation to expand geographic targeting orders to help the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network crack down on money laundering was included as part of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. From this work, it became clear that terrorists and criminal actors are increasingly relying on digital currencies, including Bitcoin, to fund their illicit activities. For example, in yesterday's New York Times, there's an article by Kevin Werbach who talks about the fact that the Russian hackers who hacked the DNC website paid for their domain names and other overhead costs with Bitcoin. And in August of 2015, a Virginia man was sentenced to 11 years in prison for providing material support to ISIS. He had admitted to using Twitter to provide instruction on how to use Bitcoin to mask the provisions of funds to that terrorist group. In December of 2017, a woman in New York was indicted for bank fraud and money laundering to support terrorists. She's alleged to have spent about $62,000 in digital currencies to engage in a pattern of financial activity designed to ultimately benefit ISIS. So I'm very pleased that this legislation before us today helps address this emerging threat in multiple ways. First, this bill establishes a public-private sector task force to research terrorist and illicit use of financial technologies, including digital currencies, and to develop proposals to counter such terrorist and illicit uses. The bill also establishes a fund to pay rewards to people who provide information leading to the conviction of an individual involved with terrorist use of digital currencies. And finally, the bill creates a grant program for the development of tools and pilot programs to detect terrorists and illicit uses of digital currencies. As such, again, I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, and all of our colleagues, and I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for those kind words and for his bipartisan work on the bill, and also recognize the gentleman from North Carolina and his work on the bill. As the chairman of the Terrorism Illicit Finance Subcommittee, we've been hearing of the ways that our financial system is being abused by people who intend personal financial gain. The Financial Technology Protection Act is a step in the right direction to reverse this trend. This bill establishes an independent financial technology task force whose goal is to improve coordination between private and public sectors to research and develop legislation to decrease the illicit use of cryptocurrencies. The rise of cryptocurrencies has allowed for many across the globe to move anonymously and give access to them to the financial markets. We've seen examples of cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin being used to finance terrorist organizations, purchase illicit drugs, and be used in human trafficking operations. The bill's task force would be composed of 6 high-ranking government officials, such as the Secretary of Treasury and the Attorney General, as well as 6 appointed members from the private sector. This public-private task force will be able to recognize the latest ways in which cryptocurrencies are being used for illegal activities and better inform lawmakers on how to stop these evolving uses. In addition, this bill sets up a reward pool for people who provide information leading to a conviction of an individual involved with terrorism and digital currencies. This bill also addresses the sense of Congress that the federal government should prioritize the investigation of terrorist use of financial technology, including these digital currencies. So I would yield passage of this legislation supported. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the substitute amendment for H.R. 5036, the Financial Technology Protection Act, which would strengthen our efforts to deter terrorists and illicit uses of financial technology. Although financial technology has potential benefits to the economy, there are pressing concerns about digital currencies facilitating terrorist financing and money laundering. For example, in August 2015, a Virginia man was sentenced to 11 years in prison for providing material support to ISIS, the terrorist organization fighting in Iraq and Syria, and had admitted to using Twitter to provide instruction on how to use Bitcoin to mask the provision of funds to ISIS. The use of digital currencies is even more pervasive for non-terrorist criminal activity. For example, in September 2017, the Department of Justice announced the forfeiture of over $48 million in proceeds from the sale of over 140,000 Bitcoins derived from Silk Road criminal marketplaces' illegal activities. Also on July 13th, Special Counsel Robert Mueller indicted 12 Russian intelligence officers for hacking into the Democratic National Committee during the 2016 presidential election. The hackers used cryptocurrency to purchase the servers and other equipment necessary for the email breaches and use Bitcoin to help fund their activities. This bill would aim to combat this type of illicit activity by establishing a public-private sector task force that would research terrorist and illicit uses of financial technologies, including digital currencies, and develop proposals to counter such terrorist illicit uses. The bill would also establish a grant program to develop tools to detect terrorists and illicit uses of these currencies, and it would establish a reward for any person who provides information leading to the conviction of an individual involved with an illegal use of digital currencies. Finally, this bill would require the government to identify how state and non-state actors and foreign terrorist organizations evade sanctions, finance terrorism, or launder money using these currencies. I thank Congressman Budd and Lynch for introducing this bipartisan legislation and for working with me to further strengthen this bill. I urge support for this bill, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to commend Mr. Budd on his work on H.R. 5036, the Financial Technology Protection Act. Recently, it came to light that Russian operatives accused of hacking the Democrat National Committee in 2016 paid for servers and domain names by using Bitcoin, a method of secure payment that can be manipulated to shield owners from banks, government authorizations, and verified identities. While research indicates that only a small proportion of the blockchain transactions are used for illicit financing, it is important to recognize that digital currencies and ledger systems pose an emergent threat to governmental capacity to be able to combat illicit activity. Mr. Budd's bill would work to mitigate that threat by organizing an interagency independent financial technology task force to improve coordination between public and private sectors, to research and develop legislative and regulatory proposals to decrease terrorist and illicit use of new financial technologies, including digital currencies. This bill will generate a new wealth of working knowledge on digital currencies and indicate that the United States government is taking financial technology seriously. If we are to remain serious about our commitment to combating terrorism and illicit financing, we need to understand the threats posed by the new technological frontier. And Mr. Budd's bill makes strides towards that goal. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to encourage my colleagues to be able to support this bill. And again, thank Mr. Budd for all of his hard work as well as Mr. Lynch. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to commend Mr. Budd for this bill. It's a great solution. I really appreciate Mr. Foster and the bipartisan effort that's been able to make it move forward. And as we've sat through numerous hearings, it's caused me great concern as I've listened to some of our colleagues express fears. And fears have caused people to overreact to say shocking things like, why would anyone need access to this technology? Only criminals would need access to this. This could be abused. Thankfully, this mindset didn't take hold when we were trying to develop the internet. Blockchain truly has the opportunity to be transformative in the same sort of way. And frankly, as I've talked to people in the private sector, they've expressed a lot of concern that Congress is going to mess this up, that this market isn't going to happen in the United States of America, that Europe is going to take hold and surpass us. Think of how different the U.S. economy would be if we had not been the home of innovation, where technology flourished in the age of the internet, and that's the same thing that could be different in this next era. We have the best markets for goods, services, capital, intellectual property, and we need to make sure that we don't stifle this flourishing opportunity with blockchain technology. Mr. Budd's bill, Mr. Foster's initiative, is a bipartisan step in that direction, and I encourage all of our colleagues to embrace not just this bill, but the underlying embrace of blockchain and its true potential for the American economy. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption of the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it, and the ayes have it. The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized for what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Does the gentleman seek a recorded vote?
I do seek a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you. The recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number have raised their hands. A recorded vote is ordered. And pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 6332. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 6332, to require the Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to submit a report to Congress on the way in which data collected pursuant to Title 31 is being used.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the committee's consideration of this important piece of legislation here today. The work of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee has uncovered time and again that illicit activities are powered through financing and that illicit operations can't continue if the revenue streams funding those operations are shut off. H.R. 6332, the Improving Strategies to Counter Weapons Proliferation Act, would help make efforts countering weapons proliferation financing more effective by studying the signs of proliferation financing more closely. This legislation would study how our financial institutions, intelligence collecting agencies, and law enforcement share information regarding known weapons proliferation financing activities to better identify what specific activities indicate engagement with proliferation financing. To effectively prevent the spread of dangerous weapons, we must close the gaps that allow bad actors to take advantage of the global financial system. In the United States, we have robust protections in place to help prevent the financing of weapons proliferation involving suspicious activity reports that go to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and get reported over to law enforcement by requiring FinCEN to report yearly to Congress on the intelligence products it generates from SARS filings on proliferation finance transactions and how those intelligence products have informed law enforcement action. We can learn the indicators of proliferation finance and to be able to more effectively combat these illicit financial activities, as publicly available information about proliferation financing is relatively sparse globally. This bill could provide a pathway to careful education and regarding proliferation financing that could have global implications. This bill is also timely, as the United States just assumed the presidency of the Financial Action Task Force, an intergovernmental organization founded to develop policies to globally combat money laundering. After learning the signs of proliferation financing, the United States can provide leadership to the rest of the world in countering weapons proliferation financing among the world's bad actors. Nations and bad actors wishing to build dangerous weapons illegally must be able to access and exploit the global financial system, and the United States can lead in combating bad actors' access. In short, H.R. 6332 will provide greater clarity in Congress on an opaque subject that will help maximize current efforts to counter proliferation financing and offer a platform to build on for future policy. I'd like to commend my colleague, Ms. Sinema, for leading this effort with me, and I'd like to encourage my colleagues to move this legislation out of the committee here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Henserling, and thank you to Congressman Tipton of Colorado for working with me to crack down on attempts by rogue states, criminal organizations, and terrorists to finance the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Mr. Chairman, Arizonans are rightfully concerned about the security threats we face and the government's ability to keep our country safe. Instead of conventional weapons and soldiers in uniform on battlefields, evolving threats to our country come from rogue regimes with nuclear weapons and from terrorists with improvised devices or chemical and biological weapons. We need to work together to keep our country safe, and our responses must be tough and smart. To take on the likes of North Korea, Iran, ISIS, and other dangerous entities, we need secure borders, a strong military, and enduring collaborative relationships with our allies. We also need actionable intelligence leading to strategies that deter, deny, and defund our enemies. Congressman Tipton and I introduced the Improving Strategies to Counter Weapons Proliferation Act to improve the federal government's ability to stop the financing of rogue states, transnational criminal organizations, and terrorist groups. By passing H.R. 6332, we're going after these groups where it hurts, the bank account. Our bill develops tools that the intelligence community and law enforcement can use to identify and stop transactions linked to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It's critical that we work together to ensure the government makes the most of the intelligence it's given. One key insight from the report required by our bill could stop a would-be terrorist from getting the money needed to build a dirty bomb, and that would save lives. We must do everything possible to keep Arizona families safe, including giving our intelligence community and law enforcement the tools they need to stop weapons proliferation. Thank you, Chairman Henserling and Ranking Member Waters, for your support of this important bipartisan legislation, and I'll continue to work across the aisle to protect Arizonans and Americans from the threat we face. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I would now recognize myself for 5 minutes. The proliferation networks often use established financial mechanisms such as wire transfers, trade finance products, cash, checks, and credit cards to finance their weapons programs. This is accomplished through elaborate ownership structures consisting of various businesses, shell corporations, and middlemen in order to obscure any connection to the hostile nation. As bad actors continue to evolve in the ways they access the traditional financial marketplace, we must ensure that our government agencies and financial institutions have the tools necessary to detect these illicit procurement efforts. This bill, submitted by Mr. Tipton and Ms. Sinema, will help solve this problem. H.R. 6332 requires the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, better known as FinCEN, to report to Congress any filings from the Bank Secrecy Act have to do with proliferation finance transactions. In addition, this report must include FinCEN's efforts to collaborate with law enforcement and other members of the intelligence community. Evidence has shown that hostile actors around the world, specifically Iran, Syria, and North Korea, have been pursuing the proliferation of WMDs for years. As sanctions are implemented, removed, or modified on these countries, we ensure our agencies have the capabilities to monitor the resulting financial activity, of these nations to ensure that there is no resulting weapons buildup. I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation and urge support. Who seeks recognition? And for what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support H.R. 6332, the Improving Strategies to Counter Weapons Proliferation Act, which aims to better inform congressional oversight of FinCEN's counter-proliferation finance efforts. With proliferation threats from countries like North Korea and Iran growing, the reports prescribed by this bill will tell Congress more about the terrorist financing and anti-money laundering work that FinCEN is doing to combat the financing of the manufacture and delivery of weapons of mass destruction. This bill will require FinCEN's director to report on the intelligence products that FinCEN generates from the Bank Secrecy Act filings on suspected proliferation finance transactions, the agency's efforts to maximize the use of collected data, and the advisory notices issued to financial institutions related to the finances of chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons. The ACLU has expressed some concern about the bill, in part because the bill's report doesn't include details on the efficacy of FinCEN's data collection or its impact on privacy and civil liberties. That said, I understand that the ACLU does not intend to actively oppose the bill, and given that the legislation is focused on how FinCEN uses the data it currently collects and does not expand that data collection, I think that the bill is appropriately scoped, and I support it, and I ask my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. I'm going to call this up.
There we go. It's rock and roll. Just me and you, buddy.
Okay. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2570. The clerk will report the bill, which is distributed in advance.
H.R. 2572, the amend the Truth in Lending Act.
Without
to
objection, the
clarify-
bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, the sponsor of legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve Jobs once lamented, there are downsides to everything. There are unintended consequences to everything. One of the many unintended consequences of the Dodd-Frank Act can be seen in the qualified mortgage rule. My bill, the Mortgage Fairness Act, will provide a small and simple fix by addressing the disproportionate impact the current law and the implementing rule have on the market for mortgages originated by mortgage brokers for their consumers. When we unintentionally create a barrier to efficiency in any one of our market segments, we restrict competition and drive up mortgage costs for consumers. Anything that restricts the flow of funding to these markets impedes the American dream of homeownership. The qualified mortgage rule is intended to provide a process for assuring that lenders have addressed truth in lending and the ability of the borrower to repay the mortgage. A qualified mortgage bestows a safe haven to the lender for certain potential pathways of litigation if the borrower defaults on a mortgage. Currently, the law states that a qualified mortgage may not have fees and points that total more than 3% of loan value. And let me just throw in here right now, if you're getting a mortgage and it's going to be 4 points, what they'll do is reduce it to 3. They'll just charge you a lot more interest rate, which is really unfair to the consumer. Unfortunately, in the statute, points and fees include all compensation paid directly or indirectly by a consumer or creditor for a mortgage originator. That's where the problem comes in. If the creditor pays part of the fees to the broker, then that amount will be reflected in the interest rate the consumer pays, as I just gave you an example. The intent of the qualified mortgage is to assure the ability of the borrower to repay it. It's apparent that under the current law, a fee paid by a lender to a broker will be counted twice in determining the ability to pay a qualified mortgage, once in the interest rate and again in the cap fee. The result is that a mortgage originated by a broker is more likely to end up outside the definition of a qualified mortgage and without any rationale related to the borrower's ability to repay. In sum, the current law discriminates against mortgage brokers and the consumers they serve. When the qualified mortgage rule was created, we ended up with the unintended consequences of limiting competition and raising mortgage costs without any guarantee of increasing a consumer's ability to repay. No benefit to the consumer, actually. Mr. Chairman, once again, this bill eliminates an unintended consequence of the Dodd-Frank Act. It levels the playing field in the mortgage market where the mortgage brokers provide a vital service and enables them to compete to bring mortgage costs down across the market to benefit consumers. I ask my colleagues to join me in eliminating the current inefficiency and inequity to improve mortgage market performance for all consumers by supporting H.R. 2570, the Mortgage Fairness Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes? The gentlelady from California, ranking member, seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, during this session of Congress, this committee has advanced numerous measures that would undermine the Consumer Bureau's ability to protect borrowers and homeowners. This includes several bills that would weaken consumer protections under the Dodd-Frank Act, the Truth in Lending Act, and the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. But here we are again considering yet another bill that would further erode these protections. This bill, the so-called Mortgage Fairness Act, would weaken borrower protections under the Consumer Bureau's final rule on ability to repay by excluding certain types of mortgages, types of mortgage loan originated compensation from the points and fees cap for qualified mortgage or QM loans. Qualified mortgages are important loans that ensure that borrowers have the ability to repay their mortgage loan, inclusive of all fees. And if a lender originates a qualified mortgage loan, it is assumed that the lender followed the Consumer Bureau's ability to repay rule, including the rule's 3% cap on points and fees for the borrower's mortgage, H.R. 2570, which changed this calculation by excluding certain types of loan originator compensation from the 3% cap on points and fees for QM loans. By changing the points and fees calculation in this way, H.R. 2570 would make it harder to trigger important consumer protections that currently exist for certain high-cost mortgages under the Truth in Lending Act. This is why 18 consumer and civil rights groups, including the NAACP and the National Consumer Law Center, drafted an opposition letter against H.R. 2570, saying, and I quote, "High-cost mortgage loans come with special protections, but this bill will allow lenders to evade those extra rules," quote unquote, and that, quote, "A vote to support this bill is a vote to promote predatory mortgage lending," unquote. Let us not forget that in drafting Dodd-Frank, Congress intentionally included all types of loan originator compensation in the mortgage points and fees calculation to disincentivize the types of abusive loan steering that led to the 2008 financial crisis. We should not be in the business of further undermining consumer protections under Dodd-Frank and the Truth in Lending Act, so I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. Who will seek recognition? And with that, I will recognize myself. Move to strike the last word. I want to thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for bringing this issue to our attention and for his tireless work on this legislation. Congress passed the Truth in Lending Act in 1968 in an effort to ensure greater transparency and fairness in lending. That was the same talking point used by supporters of Dodd-Frank. Though intended to keep consumers safe from predatory lending practices, the resulting regulatory regime has made lending, particularly mortgage lending, so difficult that in some institutions have discontinued products and services to those who may need them most. Despite what we've heard 8 years ago, that creates neither transparency nor fairness in lending. We've made tremendous progress in terms of regulatory reform, but more needs to be done. We need to continue to take responsible steps to reduce burdens facing lenders and their borrowers. Mr. Posey's bill would address a definitional error that stands between Americans and fair market-priced loans. By listing brokerage fees twice in mortgage contracts, pursuant to the points and fees rules promulgated by the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, low and middle-income borrowers have become ineligible for reasonably priced loans. H.R. 2570 will allow for fair, more competitive practices in mortgage lending and take a small step toward creation of a streamlined, more reasonable mortgage process. While we have to ensure that there are safeguards for mortgage lending in place, we shouldn't make the mortgage process unnecessarily difficult or more expensive. I want to again commend my friend from Florida to thank him for his leadership on this initiative. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Anyone else seek recognition? Would Mr. Williams or Mr. Davison like to be recognized and yield time?
Move to strike the last word? Or, yes, I'd like to balance time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the work on this bill. And, you know, having recently closed on mortgages and looked at the package of paperwork that's there, and you look at the reforms that were well-intentioned, the duplication of effort, the duplication of paperwork, the duplication in underwriting processes, the intent is good. We want to have a safe and sound housing market. We want to have safe and sound underwriting practices, and we want to make sure consumers can afford the loans and, in fact, understand the risks they're taking before they do them. But removing the duplication sometimes can be a good thing. We want to make sure that we've done our work, but we don't need to make sure that we don't need to put extra cost, extra complications, because rather than the consumer being well-served and able to understand what they're doing, the packet just gets thicker, more complicated, more convoluted, and the intent of consumer protection is made murky. And so I think this is a good step in the right direction. I commend the work that's been done on it, and I urge all of our colleagues to support its adoption. I yield the balance of time. To Mr. Posey.
Gentleman yields to Mr. Posey.
Thank you. You know, I think the original purpose of this law was that we would have transparency and disclosure, and there would be no hidden way to exploit anyone or to harm them. And it's gone far beyond that now to the point where it does harm them. I would not have been able to purchase my first home under this regulation had it been in effect then. I just wouldn't have been able to do it unless they jacked the interest rate way up to compensate for that, which would have made it for 30 years or however long I had that home harder for me to enjoy that home. When the government grabs arbitrary limits out of their sky, out of their ear, or any other place they get these limits from, it usually has unintended consequences. I mean, just like the proposal that the government pass a law that you shouldn't be able to charge more than $1 for a gallon of gasoline. Well, that might make a lot of consumers happy, might make some people that have a tremendously good grasp on a small picture very happy. But the reality is, you just said people can't have gasoline anymore because nobody's going to sell it for $1 a gallon. And I'm afraid if we keep toying around with this stuff, we're going to do the same thing to the housing market. And I think I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back, I assume?
Yes, correct. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Okay, anyone else seek recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it.
Recorded vote is requested.
The gentlelady from California has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number have raised their hands. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3626. The clerk will report the bill, which is distributed in advance.
H.R. 3626, to amend the Bank Service Company Act to provide improvements with respect to state banking agencies and for
Without
other
objection, the bill is
purposes.
considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, to sponsor legislation for 5 minutes.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlemen, you need to speak on the bill first and then request. Is that right? Thank you. The amendment can't be, the amendment can't be delayed yet, or can't be handed out yet.
Okay, got it.
Mr. Williams, recognized to discuss your bill, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 3626, the Bank Services Company Examination Coordination Act, is a bipartisan effort to enhance the coordination of examinations between state and federal regulators. As technology service providers play an increasingly operational role in the banking industry, the need for regulators to coordinate exams and share information is more important than ever. The 2017 annual report of the Financial Stability Oversight Council encouraged further coordination between state and federal regulators. The report said this: finally, the authority to supervise third-party service providers continues to vary across financial regulators. The Council supports efforts to synchronize these authorities and enhance third-party service provider information security. The Council recommends that Congress pass legislation that grants examination and enforcement powers to the SEC, CFTC, FHFA, and NCUA to oversee third-party service providers and encourages coordination among federal and state regulators in the oversight of these providers. This will both reduce potential conflicting and duplicative regulatory oversight and promote more consistency in cybersecurity. Under the current system, banks partner with TSPs contracting several functions critical to the banking industry. These services could include process or management services to facilitate loans, deposits, or payment services. To provide the best services to the consumer, banks are partnering with financial technology companies to remain competitive and profitable. I want to be sure to highlight what H.R. 3626 will not do. This legislation will not disturb the dual banking system and does not grant examination authority to any states that are not permitted to do so under state law. 38 states currently have authority to examine TSPs and the risks they pose to client banks and the banking system as a whole. That authority is granted them by the respective state legislature, not the federal government. We must amend the BCSA to appropriately reflect the authority for states to examine TSPs. Doing so will improve state-federal coordination and promote information sharing and more efficient supervision. H.R. 3626 will reduce regulatory burden, a key tenet of this administration and House Republicans. Further, this will prevent duplicative examinations and streamline efficiencies between state and federal regulators. TSPs are a critical component of our state and federal banking infrastructure. Ensuring our examiners have the necessary tools at their disposal to protect the health and welfare of our financial institutions for American families and businesses is of the utmost importance. I urge support for this legislation as amended and encourage all of my colleagues to support this bipartisan effort. With that, I yield my time back, Chairman.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point.
I have an amendment.
The gentleman yields back. First, we'll okay, the gentlelady from California, the ranking member, is recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the sponsors of H.R. 3626 for the work on this bill, which would promote better coordination between federal and state banking regulators as they oversee third-party vendors and companies that provide a wide range of services for banks. In recent years, technology has disrupted every industry, including banking, and given the significant cybersecurity risk that come with that technology, it is imperative that Congress close any regulatory gaps. To that end, FSOC recommended Congress pass legislation to strengthen oversight of these third-party companies to improve cybersecurity. Furthermore, given the increase in fintech companies that partner with banks, especially state-chartered banks, it is important that we consider ways to encourage innovation that promotes greater access to credit, but in a safe manner with appropriate, well-coordinated oversight at the federal and state level. I encourage members to support H.R. 3626, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. With that, I move to strike the last word to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to first thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for bringing this issue to light and for working diligently to find a solution. It's no secret that banks, particularly community banks, are often caught in a confusing, onerous web of state and federal regulations. While some of those regulations are necessary, they can be disproportionately burdensome for smaller banks, those that simply do not have the financial assets or staff capabilities to devote to regulatory practices meant to apply to more complicated institutions. To make matters worse, the examination environment has become uncooperative and unproductive. I hear it from institutions of all sizes on a daily basis. There's a very serious need for better coordination and communication among examiners. The legislation introduced by my friend from Texas strikes at one facet of this serious concern by fostering better coordination between state and federal banking regulators. The Bank Service Company Examination Coordination Act would require state and federal agencies to share information on a bank's technology vendors and partners. As financial institutions increasingly rely on technology to improve their services, the risk of cybersecurity threats is heightened. We all recognize that cybersecurity failures present a risk to institutions, their customers, and the strength of our financial system. This legislation helps to advance this issue and, through coordination, strengthen the security of our economy. Frustrations between banks and their regulators are at what seems to be an all-time high, and there's an obvious disconnect between state and federal entities. When state regulators examine third-party service providers, they should have a clear avenue of communication to federal regulators. When that coordination doesn't take place, neither state nor federal regulators come away with a clear picture of the condition of the institution, leading to more work, more examinations, and more unnecessary use of time and resources. Our banks are foundational parts of our communities, and to ignore their push for smarter regulation, we have a mistake. H.R. 3626 is common sense, responsible legislation, and I hope each of my colleagues will join me in supporting it today. I want to commend the gentleman from Texas and thank him again for his leadership. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause while the amendment is distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment by Mr. Williams. Page 4, line 4, strike the
Without
examination.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized on his amendment. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my amendment is simple and straightforward. It clarifies that the authorities granted in H.R. 3626 apply specifically to state banking agencies that are permitted to examine a bank service company under state law. I was happy to work with several of my colleagues and their staff to reach agreement on this limited, closely tailored amendment. I'd like to also take this opportunity to draw attention to why this bill is important and why supporting this amendment and ultimately H.R. 3626 is so important. In February of this year, Mr. Brian Schneider, Secretary of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, testified before this committee. During his testimony, I asked Mr. Schneider to highlight the importance of this legislation and what it means for state regulators, and Mr. Schneider responded accordingly. It is critically important to making the financial services regulation system more efficient. As I mentioned throughout, one of my themes is we're out there every day as state regulators doing this work, examining these third-party services providers, for many of which are money service businesses and new fintech innovators. And for us not to be able to communicate freely with our federal counterparts, for them to know what we're doing and for us to know what they're doing, just results in more examinations, more work, more regulatory burden that seems unnecessary because it's just duplicative at that point in time. So the simple change that your bill, the simple common sense change that your bill would provide could greatly impact a reduction in regulatory burden. So I ask for your support of this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and for your support of H.R. 3626. I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Seeing one, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. One. A sufficient number of having raised their hands. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee's rules, the vote on this question is postponed. It only takes one, right? Committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. The chair anticipates that we will reconvene at 3:30.